Margaret Crane was the epitome of suburban authority, and she reveled in it. A woman in her late 40s with a sharp chin and an even sharper tongue, she commanded attention the moment she entered a room. Her neighbors, however, wouldn't use the term command as a compliment. As the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, in the gated community of Willow Creek, Margaret wasn't just someone who held a title. She was the ruler of her small kingdom, and she made sure everyone knew it. Every morning, Margaret took her stroll around the neighborhood with her Yorkshire Terrier, Bella. Both of them gave the impression that they were inspecting every inch of the area. Bella, in her matching red sweater, would prance along like the queen's pet, while Margaret scrutinized the lawns, driveways, and mailboxes, waiting for any imperfection. She was ruthless, always armed with a clipboard that served as her weapon of choice. The slightest overgrown grass, an ill-placed garden gnome, or a fence that wasn't painted to her standard was grounds for a fine, and Margaret delighted in issuing them. She loved the power it gave her. She'd walk by the Harris family's house and see the small, colorful inflatable Santa in their yard. "Tacky," she'd mutter under her breath, knowing a fine was on the way. The Millers next door would park their RV in the driveway instead of the designated space. "That's a $100 fine," she'd think, making a note on her clipboard as if she was writing the future of the entire neighborhood. Most people dreaded her presence. Margaret wasn't just petty, she was obsessed with her authority. She thought being the HOA president meant she could tell everyone how to live their lives. Her tone was always laced with judgment, and she never missed a chance to remind the other homeowners of their inferiority. She felt that her position made her untouchable, and in her mind, that untouchability was not only deserved, it was earned. Her neighbors had little choice but to put up with it. Anyone who tried to stand up to Margaret quickly found themselves blacklisted, receiving fines for infractions they didn't even know existed. And when someone dared to challenge her authority, she used her power to make life difficult, enforcing policies with a strictness that bordered on obsessive. Whether it was the Martinez family, whose grass turned an unapproved shade of green, or the Wilsons, who mistakenly planted the wrong kind of rose bush, Margaret was there, clipboard in hand, ready to punish. Margaret's favorite part? The fear she instilled in everyone. She was like the shadow that loomed over every backyard barbecue and every quiet evening on the porch. The other residents spoke of her with a mix of disdain and anxiety, knowing that any minor mistake could result in an unwanted visit or a hefty fine. And Margaret thrived on this. She was convinced that her position made her a figure of respect, someone who demanded obedience. As the years went on, she grew more confident that her reign would never end. But power, especially power built on fear, has a way of backfiring. And soon enough, Margaret would learn just how fragile her control really was. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Margaret first spotted the black sedan parked in the driveway of the Thompson house. She was doing her usual morning patrol, clipboard in hand, inspecting the neighborhood's floss. It was early, the sun barely peeking through the trees, and the air still crisp with the remnants of the night. Her eyes immediately landed on the car, and her stomach churned. The vehicle was unlike anything else on the block. The sedan was sleek, all black, with tinted windows that blocked the view inside. There were no visible license plates, a clear violation of HOA standards that demanded all vehicles be identifiable at a glance. The car was parked in front of the Thompson house, a quiet family of four who had always maintained a good relationship with Margaret, until now. Margaret's mind raced. This is an obvious violation, she thought. How dare they think they can get away with something like this? The Thompsons, who were known for their lackluster attention to detail, were now stepping over the line. She glanced over her shoulder to see if any of the neighbors were around to witness her discovery. A discovery she was about to turn into an opportunity to flex her power. Without hesitating, Margaret took out her phone, her fingers typing furiously. She quickly dialed the towing company she always used for neighborhood issues. As the phone rang, Margaret smirked, knowing that in minutes, this car would be towed away, sending a message to the entire neighborhood about who was in charge. "Hello, this is Margaret Crane from Willow Creek HOA," she said in her cold, official tone, barely giving the operator time to speak. "There's a car in front of the Thompson house with no plates, parked illegally. I need it removed immediately." The operator hesitated for a moment, clearly sensing Margaret's urgency. "Are you sure, ma'am? I mean, it's just a car." No excuses, Margaret snapped. It's a violation of HOA rules. It doesn't matter who owns it. Get it removed right now. She hung up the phone, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over her. She had done her job. The neighborhood would know she was serious about enforcing the rules, and the Thompsons would know better than to break them again. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, watching the tow truck arrive. The large, imposing vehicle rolled down the street, the sound of its tires on the pavement echoing in the still morning. She watched as the tow truck driver got out, ready to do her bidding. But as the tow truck approached the black sedan, something caught Margaret's eye. A figure standing just behind the car, watching the scene unfold. A man in a dark jacket, his face serious but calm, stood with his hands in his pockets. He was observing the tow truck's movements with an odd, almost detached interest. Margaret didn't recognize him. He wasn't from the neighborhood, but it didn't matter. She'd see him later, probably at a neighborhood meeting, and she'd give him a piece of her mind about respecting HOA rules. But first, she had to savor the moment. The car would be gone soon, and she'd have one more victory to add to her ever-growing list. She didn't realize, though, that this would be the moment her belief in untouchability would be shattered for good. As the tow truck driver unlatched the cables, preparing to hoist the black sedan, a calm but firm voice cut through the morning air. "Hold on a second." The tow truck driver paused, his hands still on the vehicle, but his attention now turned to the man stepping out from behind the sedan. The man was tall, with short cropped hair, wearing a black jacket that was snug against his muscular frame. His demeanor was composed, but there was an undeniable authority about him that immediately drew attention. He wasn't one of the usual neighbors. Margaret certainly didn't recognize him. "Who are you?" Margaret snapped, her voice laced with irritation. She stood up straighter, arms still crossed, her eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. The man didn't seem fazed by her sharp tone. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, slowly pulling out a badge that gleamed under the early morning sun. He flipped it open with practiced ease. "I'm Officer James Porter." "Undercover," he said, his voice steady and calm. "This is my car." Margaret blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. The officer's badge glinted in the sunlight as she squinted at it. An unmarked police vehicle? Before she could respond, Officer Porter continued, his tone shifting slightly. "What you're doing is illegal. Towing a police vehicle, especially an unmarked one, is a serious offense." The tow truck driver froze, his eyes widening in disbelief as he slowly let go of the cables in his hand. He'd been about to tow the car of a law enforcement officer, and that realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The mistake was monumental. Margaret, still unable to grasp the gravity of the situation, stepped forward, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean?" she asked, though the words were barely coherent in her mind. "This is an obvious violation of HOA rules." Officer Porter shook his head, a slight frown pulling at his lips. "No, what you're doing is a violation of the law. This vehicle belongs to the department. Towing it could have led to legal repercussions for you, the towing company, and the city." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But that's not the worst part. You just wasted public resources over something you didn't even understand." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to reconcile what she was hearing. Her perfect little world of neighborhood rule enforcement, where she was always right, was shattering right before her eyes. She had no idea this was an undercover police car. She didn't even think to ask. She just assumed she had the power to handle whatever situation she saw fit. The tow truck driver, now thoroughly embarrassed, muttered an apology, his face flushed with regret. He quickly climbed back into the truck, avoiding eye contact with both Margaret and Officer Porter. The officer didn't look at Margaret. Instead, he addressed the driver. "Just make sure you don't make this mistake again. The city can't afford to keep responding to these calls." The words stung Margaret more than she realized. This was no longer just a misstep. It was a public humiliation in front of the whole neighborhood. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. She realized then that there was no way out. The officer wasn't going to back down. Her reign of power, built on petty rules and intimidation, was being dismantled in the space of a few seconds. "Next time," Officer Porter added, his eyes locking onto Margaret with a subtle but powerful glare, "you might want to think twice before acting on your assumptions." As the officer turned to leave, Margaret stood frozen, her pride crumbling with every word. The scene was unfolding like a nightmare she couldn't escape. And just when she thought things couldn't get worse, she realized the full impact of her actions. This was only the beginning. The air was thick with tension. Margaret, still clutching her clipboard, was struggling to maintain any shred of her usual bravado. The officer had made it clear that what she had done was not only wrong, but could have led to serious consequences. Yet, in true Margaret fashion, she wasn't ready to back down. She was used to being the one in control, and the idea of being challenged, especially in front of her neighbors, was unbearable. Instead of offering a genuine apology or attempting to rectify her mistake, Margaret dug in her heels. "I don't care," she said, her voice rising in indignation. "Rules are rules. If the car didn't have plates, it's breaking the law. HOA rules are there for a reason." She almost spat the last word, the smugness clear in her tone. Officer Porter turned to face her fully now, his jaw tightening in frustration. "What you did wasn't just an HOA rule violation, Margaret. You tried to tow a police vehicle, an unmarked police vehicle. You don't get to just ignore the law because it suits you." Margaret's face flushed red, but she pressed on, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "I'm just doing my job. Someone has to keep this neighborhood in line, and I'm the one who does it. You shouldn't be parking that thing here, no matter who you are." "Let me make this clear," Officer Porter said, his calm tone now laced with irritation. "By calling the towing company, you wasted resources that could have been used for something important. You called in a violation based on assumptions and personal bias, and now you're wasting everyone's time." His words were measured, but they struck hard. What you did could have consequences beyond just your HOA board. Margaret recoiled slightly, not fully processing the gravity of the situation. She had thought she was untouchable, that she could wield her power with impunity. But now, the officer's words were sinking in, and the full weight of her arrogance was crashing down on her. "Do you realize what you've done?" he continued. "Your mistake could have cost taxpayers money, not to mention the resources of my department. Towing an unmarked police car, that's not a small thing. The city takes those violations seriously. What if this was an investigation? What if the person driving this car was undercover in the middle of a case? You've just put everything at risk." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but the words failed her. She wasn't prepared for this. She was so caught up in her own sense of righteousness, so certain of her control, that she had never even considered the bigger picture. She was so fixated on making a point, on punishing someone she saw as breaking the rules, that she hadn't stopped to think about what kind of vehicle she was targeting or who was behind the wheel. "Next time you decide to enforce your rules," Officer Porter finished, his voice now cold and final, "I suggest you think a little harder about the consequences. You don't get to decide what's right and wrong just because you're the HOA president." With that, he turned and walked back to his unmarked car, leaving Margaret standing there, speechless and humiliated. Around her, the neighbors had started to gather, watching the whole exchange with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. They had witnessed Margaret's overbearing tactics for years, but now they were seeing her face the consequences. Some of them exchanged glances, others whispered to one another. But one thing was clear, Margaret's power was slipping away. Margaret had always thought she was above it all, that no one could challenge her. But now, in front of everyone who had ever feared or resented her, she was exposed for what she truly was, just another person who had overstepped her bounds. And while she may have clung to her sense of authority for dear life, she knew deep down that this was the moment everything changed. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder as they slowly gathered near the curb, taking in the spectacle of Margaret's public downfall. For years, they had watched her wield her power like a tyrant, dictating the rules of the neighborhood with little regard for anyone else's opinion. But now, the situation was turning in ways no one could have predicted. They were no longer worried about being reprimanded for small infractions. Instead, they were witnessing her arrogance unravel in real time. Margaret, still standing there with her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, shifted uncomfortably under the scrutinizing stares. She had always been the one to call the shots, to make everyone else feel small. But now, her control was slipping away, and it was clear that the weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. The officer, still composed and unbothered, pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Margaret shot him an irritated glance, but he didn't seem to notice. He was clearly focused on something else, something far more significant than her petty HOA rules. Minutes later, The unmistakable sound of a patrol car echoed down the street. It was the kind of car that demanded attention, a fully marked squad car with flashing lights that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Margaret stiffened, her stomach twisting with dread. This wasn't just some incident that could be swept under the rug. As the patrol car came to a halt in front of the scene, two officers stepped out, walking toward the gathering crowd. They spoke briefly with Officer Porter, who nodded and gestured toward Margaret. The new officers didn't look at her with sympathy, though. They had already heard the full story from their colleague. The whispers from the neighbors grew louder. Some were just glad to see someone finally stand up to Margaret. Others, however, were more cautious, wondering if this could have gone differently. But no one was surprised when the call went out for an emergency HOA board meeting. The emergency meeting was called to order within the hour. In the quiet of her home, Margaret was busy pacing, wondering if this would blow over. But she knew deep down that it wouldn't. The board had been waiting for a reason to address her behavior, and this was it. By the time the meeting started, the board members, visibly frustrated, had all the information they needed. They had seen the toxic nature of Margaret's leadership for far too long, but they had also been hesitant to make a change. They feared the backlash, the pushback from Margaret's vocal supporters. But now, there was no denying the obvious. With a quick vote, one that almost seemed like a formality, Margaret was stripped of her position as HOA president. Her face turned pale, and for the first time, she could sense the weight of the decision sinking in. She had pushed too far this time. There would be no coming back from this. As if the universe wasn't done making its point, the tow truck driver, having been caught up in the mess, approached her with an invoice. He had been dragged into this debacle, and now he was making sure Margaret understood the cost of her actions. He handed her the bill, which was now far more than just a tow. It was for the time wasted, the resources used, and the trouble caused by her careless interference. The total was steep, and Margaret's face flushed with humiliation. She had already felt the sting of losing her position, but this was the final blow. The tow truck driver wasn't about to let her off the hook. "Here," the driver said curtly. "Pay up. And next time, maybe you'll think twice before getting involved in things you don't understand." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she couldn't argue. The damage had already been done. There was no reversing what had just happened. The neighborhood was already buzzing, and she knew that everyone who had ever feared her was now looking at her with disdain. Her arrogance had cost her everything. As the tow truck pulled away, Margaret was left standing there, feeling smaller than ever before. The sudden realization that her once ironclad grip on the neighborhood had turned to dust hit her like a wave, and there was no escape from it. Karma had struck hard and fast, and Margaret was left with nothing but the consequences of her own hubris. In the wake of the disaster, Margaret tried to maintain some semblance of dignity. She straightened her posture, put on her best attempt at an authoritative face, and went inside her home. But inside, she was trembling. Her mind raced through all the conversations she would need to have, all the explanations she would need to give. She couldn't understand how this had happened. How had she, the mighty HOA president, been brought down so easily? As the neighbors dispersed, still talking among themselves, Margaret's protestations were nothing more than background noise. No one was listening to her now. The smugness that had once been her shield was now an empty shell. Officer Porter walked by her house one last time, his eyes catching hers. There was no satisfaction or gloating in his gaze, just a calm, knowing look. He had made his point, and the neighborhood had taken notice. He wasn't interested in rubbing it in any further. "Think next time before you try to control everything around you," he called out without breaking his stride. The words were simple but effective, a quiet reminder of how quickly power could be lost. Inside her home, Margaret slammed the door shut behind her. The quiet was suffocating, and the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her chest. She had spent so long lording over her neighbors, building her own little empire of rules and regulations. And now, it had all come crashing down. For the first time in a long while, she felt utterly powerless. But the neighborhood wasn't powerless anymore. As the day wore on, the shift was palpable. There was no longer fear of Margaret's overreaching demands. Neighbors felt a sense of relief, a collective exhale. The new HOA leadership, composed of individuals who valued fairness and common sense, promised a more balanced approach to neighborhood life. Gone were the days of arbitrary fines and petty squabbles. In its place was a community that could finally breathe, one where the rules were enforced with clarity and consistency, not through ego or self-serving authority. The moment Margaret realized her power was gone, it felt as though a weight had been lifted from the entire neighborhood. The petty reign of Margaret, the HOA tyrant, was over, and the residents could finally enjoy their peaceful homes without fear of petty regulations or overbearing control. As for Margaret, she remained behind closed doors for the rest of the day, nursing her bruised ego and reflecting on the consequences of her actions. She had spent years building her empire, but in the end, it took only one moment of arrogance to bring it all crashing down. And as she sat alone in her quiet home, she couldn't help but wonder if she had ever truly been in control at all.